He wouldn't look at me. Not at the altar. Not when he handed me the keys to his cold stone mansion. But the silence in these empty rooms had teeth, and I had to sing to keep them from biting. Before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. The wedding did not have flowers. It did not have organ music swelling into the vaulted ceilings, or tearful guests dabbing their eyes with linen handkerchiefs. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The proxy ceremony was held in a sterile, windowless office on the edge of the city, smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. There was no white lace, pooling on the floor, no trembling exchange of rings. Instead, there was just the rhythmic, metallic hum of a fluorescent light overhead and the sharp, scratchy glide of a fountain pen across thick parchment. The designated chair beside me remained entirely empty, its worn leather upholstery offering a silent testament to the groom who refused to occupy it. My father, Thomas Vance, stood in the corner of the small room, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed firmly on the wooden baseboards. He was a broken man, proud but entirely ruined, and he had orchestrated this union to secure our failing coastal estate before the bank could strip away the last of our family history. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. I did not weep. I did not protest. I simply pulled the proxy marriage certificate toward me, the heavy paper feeling like a slab of cold iron against my fingertips. I stared at the bottom of the page. There, in precise, unyielding strokes, was the signature of Nicholas Sterling. The ink was completely dry. It did not catch the harsh overhead light. It felt ancient, as if the man had signed away his life years ago and had simply waited for someone to fill in the blank space beside him. I uncapped my own pen and pressed the nib to the paper. My hand trembled just once, sending a tiny shudder through the cursive letters of my name, Clara Vance. When I pulled away, my ink was still wet, gleaming, and fragile. I brushed my thumb over the tail end of the last letter, and it smudged, leaving a dark, smeared bruise on the legal document. His signature remained perfect and unbothered. Mine was already ruined, stained by a nervous hesitation. That smudge was the only physical proof that I had been there at all. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. By the time the lawyer stamped the final crimson seal, the sky outside had turned the color of bruised iron. A sleek, Blacktown car waited at the curb, its engine purring with a low, menacing efficiency. I climbed into the back seat alone. Thomas did not embrace me. He only gave a slow, heavy nod, a silent apology wrapped in the rigid guise of absolute necessity. I did not look back as the vehicle pulled away, the heavy tires hissing against the slick, rain-soaked asphalt. The drive to the coastal mansion took 3 hours, winding through dense, skeletal forests that clawed at the slate-gray sky. The heater in the cabin blew warm air against my ankles, yet a deep, unshakable chill had settled into my marrow. Rain turned to sleet, then to a bitter, freezing wind that battered the tinted windows like handfuls of loose gravel. I watched the ocean finally come into view. It was a violent, churning expanse of dark water, throwing itself endlessly against jagged black rocks. And there, perched on the edge of the cliff like a forgotten fortress, stood the estate. It was a sprawling structure of dark stone and towering glass windows, crescent-shaped and imposing, offering no warmth to the desolate landscape. The massive iron gates parted with a mechanical groan, swallowing the car into the sweeping gravel courtyard. When I stepped out, the winter wind immediately ripped the breath from my lungs. The freezing coastal air smelled of salt, wet pine needle, and profound isolation. I clutched my thin wool coat tighter around my shoulders, my leather boots crunching against the loose stones. There was no grand welcoming committee. No husband waiting on the marble steps to carry his new bride across the threshold. Instead, the heavy oak door swung open, and a solitary figure stood in the dimly lit foyer. Arthur Pendleton, the head butler, offered a perfectly measured bow. He was an older man with silver hair neatly combed back, dressed in a muted gray suit that seemed to blend seamlessly into the shadows of the house. He did not smile, but his eyes held a quiet, meticulous sort of kindness. He was a gentle anchor in an endless sea of stone. "Welcome to the estate, madam," Arthur said. his voice a low, steady baritone that barely echoed in the cavernous entryway. "I trust your journey was not overly taxing." "It was fine," I answered, my voice sounding incredibly small, almost swallowed by massive space. "Thank you." I stepped inside. The foyer was a towering cathedral of cold marble and dark polished wood. High above, a crystal chandelier hung unlit, catching the faint, gray light from the coastal storm outside and fracturing it into pale, icy slivers across the floor. There were no family photographs on the tables, no coats thrown casually over the banister, no warm scent of baking bread or burning firewood. The air was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old, trapped cold. "Mr. Sterling is currently indisposed," the older man continued smoothly, as if reciting a script he had memorized years ago. "He extends his deepest apologies for missing your arrival, not because he was busy, not because the storm had delayed him, but because he could not bear the liability of a human presence. I knew the truth of my new arrangement, even if the loyal servant was too polite to speak it aloud." "I understand," I murmured, slowly, untying the silk scarf from my neck. My fingers brushed the chilled surface of a console table, feeling the rigid perfection of the stone. "Is he in the house?" "He is," the butler replied, though he did not gesture toward any particular wing or hallway. "If you will follow me, I will show you to your quarters. There are a few matters we must review before you settle in." I followed him up the sweeping, thickly carpeted staircase, the silence pressing heavily against my eardrums. Every step I took felt like a blatant intrusion, a violation of a perfectly preserved tomb. My proxy husband was here, somewhere behind these thick mahogany doors, breathing the same chilled air, and yet, looking down the endless, shadowed corridors, I had never felt more entirely alone. My bedroom was located in the east wing, overlooking the turbulent ocean. It was beautiful in a clinical, entirely detached way. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall glass windows. A massive four-poster bed sat perfectly made with crisp white linen, and the air held a faint, generic scent of lavender soap. The sheets were starchy and stiff, lacking the comforting, frayed weight of the hand-stitched quilts from my childhood bedroom. They felt like a museum display, flawless, cold, and utterly uninviting. This room lacked the chipped wooden counters of my former home, the mismatched floral teacups my mother used to arrange, and the soft, erratic hum of daily life. Arthur stood near the doorway, producing a thick envelope from the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He held it out to me with a white-gloved hand. "He requested that I deliver this to you upon your arrival," the older man said gently. I took the envelope. The paper was heavy and expensive, identical to the legal document I had ruined with my trembling smudge earlier that morning. I broke the wax seal with my thumbnail and unfolded the single sheet of parchment. It was a list of strict directives, typed in crisp, flawless mechanical font. There was no greeting, no polite welcome, and no signature at the bottom. It was just a set of ironclad boundaries meant to keep me safely in my place. First condition: the west wing of the house is strictly off limits. Second condition: meals will be taken separately. You may request whatever you desire from the kitchen, but do not wait for me in the dining room. Third condition: do not seek me out. If a matter requires attention, speak to the staff. The document went on, outlining a life of complete, enforced isolation. It was an arrangement of mutual ghosts. I was to be a phantom haunting the east wing, while he remained an untouchable specter in the west. "Are these his exact words?" I asked, without our turning, keeping my gaze fixed on the violent rain lashing against the glass. "They are," Arthur replied softly, his tone carefully neutral. "My employer is a very private man. He requires a certain degree of absolute predictability in his environment. I hope you will not take it as a personal slight. It is hard to take offense from a man who refuses to exist in the same room as me," I said, my voice carefully devoid of any tremor or self-pity. "Thank you. That will be all." The butler bowed his head respectfully and retreated into the hall, pulling the heavy wooden door shut with a soft, final click. I stood alone in the center of the vast bedroom, the typed list dangling loosely from my fingers. I did not cry. Crying required a sympathetic audience, or at the very least, a genuine sense of loss. I had lost nothing today that I had not already willingly surrendered weeks ago. When the creditors called for the final time, I carefully folded the paper along its original creases and placed it inside the top drawer of the bedside table. shutting it away in the dark. 2 days passed in absolute silence. The bitter sleet had softened into a persistent, misty drizzle that cloaked the coastal estate in a thick, suffocating gray fog. I spent my solitary hours wandering the permitted areas of the house, memorizing the layout of the vast labyrinth. I traced the cracked spines of thousands of unread books in the 2-story library. I ran my fingertips over the cold, unlit hearths in the vacant drawing rooms. The mansion was a grand museum of someone else's life, and I was merely its newest, quietest exhibit. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the oppressive stillness grew too heavy to bear. I left my quarters and ventured down the main corridor, my soft-soled shoes making no sound against the thick wool runner. I had no specific destination in mind, only a desperate need to find a room that felt truly lived in, a space that held the warmth of a pulse. That was when I found his study. The door was slightly ajar, a rare and startling imperfection in an otherwise flawless house. I pushed the heavy wood open, just a fraction, and slipped inside. The air in here was remarkably different. It did not smell of sterile lemon polish or generic lavender. It smelled richly of cedarwood, old paper, and a faint, sharp trace of drawing charcoal. The walls were lined with dark oak paneling, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. It was cluttered, presenting a stark, beautiful contrast to the rest of the barren estate. Stacks of leather-bound ledgers, open books, and scattered architectural blueprints covered the polished surface. For a long moment, I simply stood by the doorway, breathing in the scent of the man I had married but never officially met. I approached the desk slowly, careful not to disturb the chaotic arrangement of scattered papers, and then I saw it. Near the edge of the desk, partially obscured by a heavy crystal paperweight, lay a silver-framed photograph. It was placed firmly face down against the mahogany, as if it had been discarded or hidden in a sudden, panicked hurry. My chest tightened with a strange, twisting curiosity. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the frame, and gently lifted it to the dim light. It was my framed face-down wedding portrait. Not a real wedding photo, as there had been no smiling photographer in that sterile proxy office, but a formal portrait Thomas had insisted I take weeks before the financial contract was finalized. In the picture, I was wearing a simple, high-necked gown, my expression guarded and entirely devoid of joy. But what made my breath catch sharply in my throat was not the painted image itself. It was the glass covering it. Right over the cheek of my painted likeness, there was a faint, distinct smudge of black charcoal dust. It was the clear, undeniable mark of a thumb. Someone had been holding this frame recently. Someone with hands stained by charcoal had sat in the dark, staring at my face, tracing the curve of my cheekbone, pressing their thumb against the cold glass before quickly shoving it face down when they heard my footsteps approaching in the hall. Not because he was indifferent, not because he felt nothing at all, but because looking at me was a terrifying liability he could not afford to indulge. A sudden sound broke the stillness, arriving as a sharp, heavy footfall in the adjoining hallway. The old floorboards creaked under the weight of someone large moving quickly. I froze, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Sterling?" I called out, my voice betraying me with a slight, involuntary tremble. The footsteps stopped instantly. There was a long, agonizing pause, a stretch of silence so thick it felt like physical pressure against my skin. I took a hesitant step toward the open doorway, the silver frame still clutched tightly in my hand. "Nicholas?" I tried again, softer this time, offering his name like a tentative olive branch. The shadow just beyond the doorframe shifted. For a split second, I saw the broad, dark silhouette of a man's shoulder, clad in a thick wool sweater. He did not turn to face me. He did not answer my call. Instead, the shadow pulled back sharply, and the rapid, heavy sound of boots, retreating down the corridor, echoed through the empty house. He was walking away. He was actively, deliberately fleeing the space the exact moment I occupied it. I stood alone in the center of the cedar-scented study, listening to the sound of a heavy door shutting violently at the far end of the forbidden west wing. I looked down at the charcoal dust on the glass of my portrait. He had touched my face in the absolute safety of his isolation, yet he flatly refused to look at me in the light. I carefully wiped the dark mark away with the pad of my own thumb, placed the frame gently back onto the desk, leaving it face up this time, and walked out of the room. The cold marble of the hallway felt a little less sterile now. The walls still held their defensive secrets, but the impenetrable armor was finally starting to crack. By the end of my first week in the coastal mansion, the persistent storm finally broke, leaving behind a pale, bruised sky. My daily routine had settled into a quiet, rhythmic isolation. I ate my meals alone in the small morning room. I walked the endless, permitted corridors. I did not attempt to seek out Nicholas again. He needed absolute predictability. And for now, I was willing to grant him that fragile illusion of control. But a house this massive could not keep all of its doors shut forever. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was exploring the far end of the east wing, a section where the lemon polish scent faded into the dusty, heavy smell of old wood and forgotten spaces. At the end of a long, shadowed hall stood a set of towering double doors, the brass handles tarnished and dull. I pressed my weight against the heavy wood, and they yielded with a low, agonizing groan. The conservatory was vast, encased entirely in tall panes of dirty glass that overlooked the jagged cliffs. Tangled, overgrown vines crawled up the exterior walls, casting fractured, skeletal shadows across the checkerboard marble floor. The air was freezing, holding a deep, stagnant chill that suggested the room had not been entered in years. And there, sitting in the absolute center of the immense, echoing space, was an out-of-tune grand piano. It was a magnificent instrument, though utterly abandoned. A thick layer of gray dust coated the polished ebony surface, and a heavy canvas dropcloth hung haphazardly over one corner, like a shroud covering a ghost. I walked slowly toward it, my boots clicking softly against the marble, my breath plumed in the freezing air as I reached out, trailing my fingertips through the thick layer of dust. I lifted the heavy fallboard. The ivory keys were yellowed, cool to the touch. I pressed a single key. The note that rang out was flat, echoing through the empty conservatory with a sharp, melancholic dissonance. It sounded like a fracture, like a voice that had forgotten how to speak. I sat down on the leather bench, a strange, overwhelming wave of recognition washing over me. We were the same, this abandoned instrument and I. Both of us placed in a beautiful, empty room, expected to remain silent, expected to ask for nothing. I spent the next 3 afternoons in the freezing conservatory. I did not ask the staff for help. I found a bucket of warm water, soft cotton cloths, and a gentle wood polish in the lower kitchens. I scrubbed the floors on my hands and knees. I polished the ebony wood until the grain gleamed under the pale winter sunlight. I carefully wiped down every single ivory key, restoring the instrument's dignity with quiet, meticulous strokes. It was the first time since my father signed the debt papers that my hands felt useful. It was the first time I felt like I was breathing my own air. I found my maternal journal in the bottom of my travel trunk, a leather-bound diary containing handwritten traditional coastal folk songs, passed down from my late mother. I placed it on the polished music stand of the neglected instrument, the worn, yellowed pages offering a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the estate. I did not sing yet. I only played the broken, dissonant chords, letting the raw, imperfect sound fill the silence of the massive, empty mansion. The silence in these rooms no longer had teeth. I was beginning to tame it. The days that followed were consumed entirely by the quiet, meticulous labor of restoration. While the rest of the massive coastal estate operated with the invisible, frictionless efficiency of immense wealth, the abandoned conservatory became my private domain of dust, rusted strings, and stubborn mechanical failures. I did not ask Arthur for assistance. I did not request the services of a professional tuner from the city, even though I knew a single word to the staff would summon one within hours. Allowing a stranger into this freezing, glass-encased room would have broken the fragile spell of ownership I was slowly casting over the space. This massive, discordant piano was the only thing in the sprawling stone mansion that did not belong to the pristine, untouchable world of my proxy husband. It was broken, neglected, and forgotten, and because of that, it felt entirely like mine. I was Clara Vance, a woman traded to settle a ledger, but in this echoing room, I was the sole author of my time. My hands, usually soft and unblemished from my quiet life back home, began to show the physical toll of my obsession. My knuckles grew raw from scrubbing the intricate wooden carvings of the piano legs, and the harsh, chemical scent of wood polish lingered permanently on my skin, easily overpowering the generic lavender soap stocked in my sterile bathroom. I welcomed the ache in my knees from kneeling on the freezing, checkerboard marble for hours at a stretch. The physical discomfort was a grounding weight. It was a tangible reminder that I was still a living, breathing woman, not just a silent ghost haunting the East Wing, and certainly not just a line item on a debt settlement contract buried in Nicholas Sterling's mahogany desk. I would spend entire afternoons just wiping away the decades of grime, tracing the delicate scrollwork on the music stand, and familiarizing myself with the sheer weight of the instrument. It was a slow, deliberate act of defiance against the clinical perfection of my new reality. It was on the fourth afternoon that I discovered the absolute stubbornness of the middle C key. The lower registers of the instrument were sluggish but compliant, their heavy felt hammers striking the rusted strings with a dull, melancholic thud that reverberated through the floorboards like a slow heartbeat. The higher keys were brittle, producing sharp, piercing notes that echoed uncomfortably against the towering glass panes of the conservatory, but the middle C was completely dead. The yellowed ivory key lay depressed, sunken below the uniform line of the keyboard, refusing to yield to the pressure of my fingertips. It was jammed tight, the internal wooden mechanism caught somewhere in the dark, dusty belly of the casing. It felt like a metaphor for the entire estate, stuck, frozen in time, and desperately unwilling to speak. I knelt closely, pressing my cheek against the cold wooden lip of the fallboard to peer into the narrow gap between the keys. The felt hammer was misaligned, wedged aggressively against a rusted metal pin. I did not have the proper tools, nor did I have the luxury of calling out for help. I did not know the correct terminology for the delicate internal anatomy of the instrument, but I understood the nature of things that had been forced into the dark and left to freeze. I understood what it meant to be locked in place by circumstances entirely outside of your own control. I reached up and pulled a simple, tarnished metal hairpin from the loose bun at the nape of my neck. My hair tumbled over my shoulder in a messy, heavy wave, but I ignored it, focusing entirely on the tiny, precise space between the keys. I slid the cold metal of the hairpin down into the narrow crevice. The space was incredibly tight, the wood swollen from years of trapped coastal moisture blowing in off the ocean. I closed my eyes, relying entirely on the tactile feedback vibrating through the thin piece of metal. I felt the exact point of resistance. I did not force it. You cannot violently pry a broken thing back into place and expect it to sing. You can only give it the space to remember how to move. I applied a slow, gentle, and utterly unrelenting upward pressure. For a long minute, nothing happened. The silence in the conservatory was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled roar of the ocean throwing itself against the jagged cliffs outside. My fingers cramped, the cold metal digging painfully into the pad of my thumb. I adjusted my grip, holding my breath, and gently twisted the hairpin just a fraction of an inch to the left. There was a sudden, dry snap. The middle C key popped up, snapping perfectly back into alignment with the rest of the ivory row. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, a small cloud of white vapor blooming in the freezing air. I withdrew the bent hairpin and carefully pressed my finger against the newly freed key. The note that rang out was flat, wavering, and deeply imperfect, but it sustained itself beautifully, echoing up into the vaulted glass ceilings with a resonant, lingering warmth. I pressed it again, then a third time, letting the sound wash over me like a sudden, unexpected blessing. I sat back on my heels, looking at the restored key, and felt a strange tight knot in my chest begin to unravel. This was my sanctuary. While Nicholas paced the forbidden corridors of the West Wing, guarding his isolation like a wounded animal, I was actively repairing the heart of the East Wing. Arthur continued to leave my meals on a silver tray outside the morning room, his meticulous presence the only proof that other humans lived here. The rest of the house staff remained unseen, moving through the hidden servant passages like silent phantoms. I was entirely alone, yet the oppressive terror of that isolation had begun to recede. There are spaces that refuse to remain hidden, drawing you in with a voiceless pull. The weather broke completely on the night of the second week, a massive, violent winter storm slammed into the Pacific Northwest coastline, turning the sky into a churning vortex of black clouds and relentless driving rain. It was past midnight. The heavy velvet drapes in my clinical, perfect bedroom were drawn tightly shut, but they could not muffle the aggressive rattle of the tall windows. I lay awake in the center of the massive four-poster bed, staring up at the dark canopy. The sheets were too crisp, too cold, feeling more like a shroud than a comfort. Every time I closed my eyes, the silent anxiety of my reality pressed down on my chest. I thought of my father, Thomas Vance, sitting in his ruined study miles away, his crushing debts wiped clean by a man who refused to even look at the woman he had purchased. I thought of the silver-framed formal photograph of myself that I had discovered by accident on his desk. I thought of the dark charcoal smudge on the glass of that portrait, the desperate, hidden touch of a phantom in the dark who wanted to reach out, but could not bridge the distance. Sleep was impossible. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating despite the chill creeping in from the stone walls. I pushed the heavy white duvet aside, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. I did not bother to put on a robe, only slipping a thick, oversized wool cardigan over my thin cotton nightgown. I opened my bedroom door and stepped out into the cavernous, shadowed hallway. The mansion at night was a different entity altogether. Without the pale gray daylight to define its boundaries, the endless corridors felt like the stone arteries of a sleeping leviathan. The wind howled against the exterior walls, causing the old floorboards to groan in deep, rhythmic complaints. I walked silently, my soft-soled slippers making no sound against the thick wool runners. I had no light, relying only on the occasional flashes of distant lightning that threw long, skeletal shadows across the marble floors. I did not head toward the kitchens to make a warm cup of chamomile tea. I did not look toward the locked, forbidden double doors of the west wing, where my husband barricaded himself. I walked directly to the end of the east corridor, pushing open the heavy brass-handled doors of the conservatory. The room was freezing. With 3 walls made entirely of glass, it offered zero insulation against the raging storm outside. A sharp, distinct scent of damp coastal pine and raw ozone bled through the microscopic cracks in the window frames, filling the space with the heavy, electric smell of the sea. It smelled wild and untamed, cutting beautifully through the sterile, lifeless air that choked the rest of the house. The rain battered the panes in sweeping, violent sheets, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the estate. The tangled vines clawing at the exterior glass writhed in the wind, casting chaotic, dancing shadows across the checkerboard floor. I walked to the center of the room and sat down on the leather bench of the out-of-tune grand piano. The worn leather groaned softly under my weight, a familiar and comforting sound. I reached out and opened my maternal journal, the frayed leather cover, soft and familiar under my fingertips. The faded, handwritten pages glowed faintly in the ambient moonlight that managed to pierce through storm clouds. I turned to a specific page, a traditional coastal lullaby about a sailor lost in a dense gray fog, searching blindly for the warmth of a distant lighthouse. My late mother used to sing it while she sewed, her voice a low, melodic hum that made the small, cramped rooms of my childhood feel incredibly vast and safe. It was a song meant to guide wandering souls back to shore, a song of patience and unwavering devotion. I placed my hands gently over the cold ivory keys. I did not play a chord. I simply took a deep, shivering breath, letting the freezing, pine-scented air fill my lungs to the absolute brim, and I opened my mouth. I began to sing. My voice was not a grand operatic instrument. It was untrained, slightly raspy from disuse, and heavily textured with the raw, unspoken grief of the past few weeks. But in the massive, empty acoustic chamber of the glass conservatory, it found a strange, overwhelming power. The sound rose up from my chest, clear and piercing, cutting straight through the violent ambient noise of the rainstorm. I sang the first verse slowly, drawing out the vowel sounds, letting the melody bounce off the cold marble floor and rise into the vaulted shadows above. It felt like a physical release. Every note was a fracture in the perfect, sterile armor of the estate. I was not the quiet, compliant debt bride sitting in this room. I was a living, breathing force, taking up space, demanding that the empty air carry the weight of my sorrow. I pressed a few careful keys to accompany myself, utilizing the middle C I had painstakingly fixed, allowing the dissonant, imperfect notes of the piano to blend with the raw edges of my voice. I closed my eyes, losing myself entirely in the rhythm of the old ballad. I sang of the freezing water, the blinding fog, and the desperate quiet yearning for a safe harbor. I poured every ounce of my isolation, my fear, and my resilient pride into the melody, projecting it upward into the dark glass ceiling. I sang until my throat ached, until the sheer force of the music vibrated in my chest, untangling the complicated knots of grief I had carried since stepping foot in this house. As I reached the final, haunting cadence of the song, I let the piano chords fade out first. I held the last vocal note, a soft, trembling vibrato that hung in the freezing air long after my breath ran out. The music stopped. The sudden absence of my voice left a heavy, vibrating silence in its wake, immediately swallowed by the steady, aggressive drumming of the rain against the glass. I kept my eyes closed, my head bowed slightly, my hands resting lightly on the cold keys. My heart was pounding, a warm, rapid rhythm, in the center of my chest. For the first time since arriving at the estate, I felt entirely at peace. I was no longer just a piece of collateral. I was a woman who had reclaimed her own voice. And then I heard it. It was a sound so slight, so meticulously restrained, that anyone else might have dismissed it as the house settling in the wind. But my ears were hyper-tuned to the acoustic reality of this room. It was a localized, specific noise, originating from the high, shadowed perimeter above me. The conservatory was bordered by an elevated mezzanine gallery, a narrow wooden walkway with a wrought iron railing that connected the upper floors of the east and west wings. The space was completely dark, cloaked in impenetrable shadows untouched by the moonlight. It was a gallery designed for observation, a place to look down upon the floor below without being seen. From the absolute center of that darkness, I heard the distinct, agonizingly slow creak of a leather shoe, shifting its weight against an old wooden floorboard. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I froze, my fingers stiffening against the ivory keys. It was not Arthur. The head butler wore soft-soled velvet slippers when moving through the house at night, and his steps were light and economical. This sound carried the heavy, grounded weight of a large man trying desperately to remain motionless. It was him, the man who had signed a contract demanding absolute physical separation. The man who had fled his own cedar-scented study the moment I spoke his name. Nicholas Sterling had left the fortified safety of the West Wing in the middle of a midnight storm, drawn out of his isolation by the sound of my voice. He was standing directly above me in the freezing darkness, leaning against the iron railing, listening. A wild, erratic spike of adrenaline shot through my veins. The skin on the back of my neck prickled with the intense, undeniable weight of being watched. He was up there. He was looking down at me in my thin nightgown and oversized sweater, bathed in the pale, fractured moonlight. The tension in the room shifted instantly, transforming the massive, empty conservatory into an incredibly intimate, suffocatingly small space. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, charged with the electricity of the storm, raging just beyond the glass. My first instinct was to snap my head upward, to stare into the shadows, and demand that he show his face. I wanted to call out his name, to force a confrontation, to shatter the absurd, ghostly rules of our arrangement once and for all. My lips parted, the sharp intake of air, ready to form the first syllable of his name. I was so tired of the distance, so incredibly exhausted by the absolute silence that governed this estate. But I remembered the silver-framed formal photograph on his desk. I remembered the smear of dark charcoal over the cheek of my painted likeness, the desperate, hidden nature of his touch. I remembered the heavy, panicked sound of his boots retreating down the hallway, because the prospect of eye contact was too heavy a liability for him to bear. If I looked up, the spell would break. If I acknowledged his presence, if I forced him into the light before he was ready, he would retreat behind his thick mahogany doors, and the armor would seal shut forever. He was a creature who survived in the unsaid spaces, terrified of his own vulnerability. I silently willed him to speak. I wanted him to command me to stop. I wanted him to order me to go back to my sterile room and never make a sound again. I waited for the harsh reprimand that would prove he was just the ruthless tycoon who had purchased my life to settle Thomas Vance's debts. I waited for him to remind me of the cold transaction that brought me here. I waited. The rain lashed against the glass. The heavy, masculine presence in the shadows above did not move. He did not retreat. He simply stood in the dark, breathing the same freezing air, anchoring himself to the space I occupied. So, I made a choice. I refused to look up. I refused to shatter the fragile, invisible thread connecting us through the freezing dark. I reached out and slowly turned the heavy, yellowed page of the journal. I found a new melody, a slower, gentler song about a hearth fire burning through a long winter night. I pressed the middle C key, its resonant, hard-won note ringing out into the silence. I took a slow breath, letting the tension bleed out of my shoulders, and I began to sing again. This time, I did not sing for myself. I directed the warmth of my raw, unpolished voice upward, casting it gently into the shadows of the mezzanine, offering the unseen man in the dark a quiet, undeniable sanctuary. I sang to prove that he did not have to hide, that even in the darkest, coldest rooms of this mansion, there was still a light left burning. Morning came quietly. The violent storm that had battered the estate all night had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a pale, washed-out sky and a profound, ringing stillness. I woke up in the massive four-poster bed, the crisp white sheets tangled heavily around my legs. My throat felt slightly raw, a physical testament to the raw emotion I had poured into the freezing air of the conservatory the night before. I lay there for a long time, watching the gray coastal light filter through the narrow gap in the heavy velvet drapes. My mind kept replaying the agonizingly slow creak of the floorboard from the dark mezzanine gallery. He had been there, the man who refused to look at me, the husband who had fled his own cedar-scented study at the mere sound of my voice, had stood in the freezing darkness just to listen to me sing. I dressed quickly, pulling on a thick wool sweater and a long, sensible skirt that swept the tops of my leather boots. I bypassed the morning room where my breakfast tray usually waited, ignoring the faint rumble of hunger in my stomach. I needed to return to the glass-encased room immediately. I needed to know if the fragile, invisible thread we had spun in the dark had evaporated with the sunrise, or if it had somehow anchored itself into the cold stone walls of the mansion. The walk down the east corridor felt entirely different today. The air did not seem quite as oppressive, the lemon-polished perfection of the hallway, feeling less like a museum and more like a space waiting to be lived in. When I reached the towering double doors of the conservatory, I stopped abruptly. They were not tightly sealed as I had left them. One of the heavy brass-handled doors was pushed open just a fraction of an inch, leaving a narrow, vertical slice of shadow. Someone had crossed this threshold long before I awoke. I pushed the heavy wood open and stepped inside. The room was still freezing, the tangled vines outside, casting their familiar skeletal shadows across the checkerboard marble floor. But the space felt fundamentally altered. It felt occupied, even in its vast emptiness. I walked toward the out-of-tune grand piano in the center of the room, my soft-soled boots making almost no sound against the stone. Resting precisely in the center of the worn leather bench was a stack of paper and a few small, deliberate objects. I approached slowly, as if a sudden movement might cause the items to vanish like a coastal mirage. The paper was a collection of pristine sheet music, bound in dark, supple leather. Resting delicately on top of the stack was a heavy professional piano tuning key, its smooth metal handle cold and gleaming in the pale morning light. Beside it sat a tiny, amber glass vial filled with fresh lavender oil, identical to the faint generic scent stocked in my sterile bathroom, but richer, purer. I stared at the arrangement, my chest tightening with a sudden overwhelming wave of emotion. These were not generic gifts. This was not a diamond necklace left in a velvet box, nor a hollow, typed apology penned by a legal secretary. These were practical, silent tools meant to nurture my art. They were a profound acknowledgement of my labor, a quiet permission to continue taking up space in his carefully guarded world. A soft cough broke the silence. I turned sharply to find Arthur standing near the arched entryway, holding a silver tray with a single porcelain cup of steaming black tea. The head butler's expression remained perfectly neutral, his silver hair immaculate, but there was a subtle, unmistakable softness in his eyes that had not been there on the day of my arrival. "I took the liberty of bringing your morning tea here, madam," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady baritone that did not echo in the massive chamber. "I suspected you might bypass the dining room today." "Thank you," I murmured, my gaze darting back to the immaculate items resting on the piano bench. I stepped closer to the instrument, my fingers trembling slightly. Did you leave these?" The older man stepped forward, placing the heavy silver tray gently onto a nearby wrought iron garden table. He smoothed the front of his tailored gray jacket with a white-gloved hand. "I am merely the caretaker of the household, madam. The master of the estate is the one who monitors its true needs. He has always possessed a profound appreciation for the proper maintenance of the instruments under this roof. He simply required someone with the patience to remind him they were still here." Arthur offered a brief, deeply respectful bow and retreated toward the door. Before stepping out into the shadowed corridor, he paused, looking up at the high, vaulted glass ceiling. "If I may say so, the acoustics in this wing are quite remarkable. Sound travels upward with great clarity, especially during a midnight storm." He did not wait for my response. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone once more. I let out a shaky breath and reached for the pristine sheet music. The leather binding felt expensive and heavy, but as I lifted the stack, a distinct scent drifted upward, cutting cleanly through the damp, pine-scented chill of the room. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. It was the rich, undeniable fragrance of cedarwood oil, the exact same scent that permeated the dark oak paneling of his forbidden study in the West Wing. It was the scent of his sanctuary. He had held these pages. Nicholas had stood in his secluded room, his charcoal-stained fingers carefully selecting this music, touching the binding before carrying it through the endless, empty corridors while I slept. He had crossed the invisible boundary into my domain, leaving behind the undeniable proof of his physical presence. We were communicating in a language entirely devoid of spoken words. He was a man terrified of the liability of eye contact, yet he was quietly dismantling his own defensive walls, one deliberate act of service at a time. I picked up the heavy tuning key, feeling its solid, comforting weight in the palm of my hand. He was giving me the means to fix the broken things in his house, and in doing so, he was silently asking me to fix the broken spaces between us. I sat down on the leather bench, the scent of cedarwood and lavender wrapping around me like a heavy, protective blanket. I uncapped the tiny amber vial, dipping the tip of a soft cotton cloth into the oil, and began applying it to the rusted metal pins inside the piano casing. The mechanical process of tuning was agonizingly slow, requiring absolute focus and a gentle hand. I fit the heavy metal key over the first oxidized pin, turning it with a slow, firm pressure until the stiff string finally tightened. I struck the corresponding ivory key, listening intently as the flat, wavering note slowly sharpened into a clear, resonant pitch. It took me over an hour to stabilize a single lower octave. The friction of the rusted metal produced a faint, sharp squeak that echoed in the glass room, but the oil slowly worked its magic, loosening decades of neglect. My hands ached, and the biting cold of the coastal morning seeped through my wool sweater, but I absolutely refused to stop. Every perfect note I coaxed from the rusted strings felt like a hard-won victory against the suffocating silence of the past 2 weeks. When my fingers grew too stiff to comfortably grip the metal tool, I set the tuning key aside and turned my attention back to the leather-bound sheet music. The pages were thick and creamy, filled with complex, beautifully printed compositions. But these were not the standard, triumphant classical pieces, meant for grand, brightly lit concert halls. As I flipped through the immaculate paper, I realized they were melancholic melodies, ancient folk songs, and quiet nocturnes designed for solitude. He had chosen them specifically for me, matching the raw, grieving tone of my unpolished voice from the night before. I bypassed the instrumental pieces, deliberately searching for a vocal arrangement. I found one toward the back of the heavy collection, a haunting melody about a desolate shore and a love lost to the relentless tide. It was a song steeped in shared loss, a narrative of two people separated by an insurmountable expanse of dark water. It was the perfect, tragic echo of our proxy marriage, a reflection of a bride and groom stranded on opposite sides of a vast stone mansion. I leaned forward to adjust the polished wooden music stand, and as I did, My knee bumped the wooden lip of the piano bench. The lid shifted, revealing that the brass hinges were slightly loose. I lifted the heavy wooden top, intending to store the tuning key safely inside the dusty interior compartment. Tucked discreetly in the far corner of the hollow wooden space, resting entirely alone, was a folded piece of heavy parchment. It was not part of the pristine collection he had left on top of the bench. This paper was older, its edges slightly frayed, holding the unmistakable, heavy weight of something deeply personal. I set the tuning key down on the marble floor and carefully unfolded the thick parchment. It was a handwritten translation of the ancient song I had just selected. The handwriting was immediately recognizable. It featured the exact same precise unyielding strokes that had signed away my father's massive debts on the legal contract. But this text was not a sterile list of household rules or a clinical financial ledger. It was a fluid, highly emotional interpretation of the lyrics, written in a dark, heavy ink that pressed deeply into the paper. I leaned closer, tracing my fingertips over the cursive words, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. The translation was heavily edited. Nicholas had written out the original, bleak lyrics, describing absolute isolation and permanent sorrow, but he had systematically gone back and crossed out the harshest terms. Where the original text spoke of an endless, freezing void, a thick, aggressive line of ink obscured the words, and directly above it, written in a slightly smaller, more hesitant hand, was the phrase "a quiet space to rest." Where the song described a lover who would never return from the dark, he had struck through the line entirely, replacing it with learns to navigate the shadows. He had rewritten the tragedy. The scarred, untouchable billionaire, who barricaded himself behind thick mahogany doors, had sat alone in his study, painstakingly altering an ancient tomb of despair into a narrative of enduring hope. I stared at the crossed-out words, my vision blurring with a sudden hot sting of tears that I did not try to blink away. I could see the exact moments his fountain pen had lingered on the page, the heavy dark ink pooling slightly where he had hesitated before committing to the softer, gentler translation. He was not a monster made of cold marble and corporate ruthlessness. He was a deeply wounded man, desperately trying to rewrite his own ending into something safe. He was stripping away the violence of the world, offering me a sheltered, modified version of the song, so that I would not have to sing of hopelessness in his home. My thumb brushed against the bottom margin of the parchment, where a single sentence stood alone, completely unedited, written with a steady, deliberate hand. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. The words sank deep into my chest, a quiet, devastating confession left in the dark for me to find. He was not asking me to cross the forbidden boundary into the West Wing. He was not demanding my gratitude for settling the Vance family debts, nor was he expecting me to perform the duties of a traditional bride. He was simply telling me that he was there, standing in the quiet margins of my life, willing to wait an eternity for me to feel secure enough to close the distance on my own terms. I placed the handwritten translation carefully on the music stand, right next to the printed sheet music. The thick paper trembled slightly under my touch. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wool sleeve, taking a deep, steadying breath that filled my lungs with the scent of pine, sea salt, and his lingering cedarwood oil. I placed my hands on the newly tuned ivory keys. I did not play the dissonant, broken chords of yesterday. I struck the first notes of the melody, the sound ringing out clear, bright, and incredibly pure against the towering glass panes. The resonance filled the massive acoustic chamber, wrapping around the cold stone pillars and rising effortlessly toward the elevated mezzanine gallery above. I opened my mouth and began to sing his revised lyrics. I did not sing of an endless void. I sang of a quiet space to rest. I poured the full weight of my voice into his chosen words, letting the gentle, hopeful translation soar into the empty mansion. We were no longer two isolated ghosts haunting opposite ends of a sprawling estate. We were bypassing the terrifying necessity of physical proximity entirely, co-authoring new reality through the shared interpretation of a text. The piano notes flowed seamlessly beneath my voice, the restored instrument responding to my touch with a renewed, vibrant life. I kept my eyes focused firmly on his heavy, precise handwriting, allowing the rhythmic cadence of his edits to guide my breath. He had given me the silent tools to restore this abandoned sanctuary, and in return, I was giving him back his own modified prayer. I did not look up into the shadowed gallery today. I did not need to see him to know he was listening. The silence in the house had completely transformed. It was no longer a defensive wall with teeth designed to keep the world out. It was a vast, echoing canvas waiting for us to fill it. As I sang the final, lingering note of the verse, I felt the profound, unmistakable gravity of a man finally leaning closer to the light. The fragile peace of that morning was a temporary illusion, a brief, deceptive lull before the true violence of the coastal winter returned. By late afternoon, the pale, washed-out sky had bruised into a deep, impenetrable violet. The Pacific Northwest storm rolled back in off the turbulent ocean with a vicious, unyielding fury, dragging a heavy wall of freezing rain and sleet across the jagged cliffs. I did not leave the conservatory. I had spent the entire day working my way through the leather-bound collection of sheet music he had left for me, letting the hours slip away into the rhythmic, meditative focus of the melodies. As the natural light faded completely, Arthur appeared silently in the arched entryway. The head butler did not ask me to retire to the safety of my room. He simply carried a long silver taper, carefully lighting a perimeter of thick, white pillar candles across the checkerboard marble floor and the wrought iron tables, offering a deep, respectful bow before retreating into the shadows of the house. The flickering amber light cast long, dancing shadows across the weathered ebony piano, creating a tiny, warm sanctuary in the absolute center of the freezing, echoing space. The temperature plummeted rapidly. My breath plumed white in the air, a visible mist, mingling with the rich, heavy scent of the lavender oil I had used on the rusted strings. I pulled my thick wool sweater tighter around my shoulders, shivering as the freezing drafts bled through the microscopic cracks in the window frames. But I kept playing. I kept singing. I was determined to finish the final piece in his pristine collection. It was a complex, soaring arrangement, demanding a level of vocal control and sheer physical endurance that I was rapidly losing. The storm outside intensified, howling against the exterior stone walls like a wounded animal. The towering glass panes rattled violently in their iron frames, bowing slightly under the immense atmospheric pressure. The acoustic reality of the room was chaotic, a battle between the aggressive roar of the elements and the fragile, sustained notes of my voice. My throat felt incredibly raw. The damp, freezing air scraped against my vocal cords like crushed glass, every breath requiring a conscious, painful effort. I pushed forward, attempting to reach the high, melancholic crescendo of the bridge. I closed my eyes, pressing the ivory keys, pulling the freezing air deep into my aching lungs. And then I faltered. The cold, the physical exhaustion, and the overwhelming emotional weight of the past 2 weeks finally collided, breaking my endurance entirely. My voice cracked. It was not a delicate, artistic waver. It was a harsh, sudden, and deeply painful fracture. The high note died in the back of my throat, collapsing into a dry, breathless gasp. My fingers stumbled on the keyboard, producing a jarring, unresolved dissonance that hung terribly in the freezing air. I dropped my hands to my lap, bowing my head as a profound wave of defeat washed over me. The music stopped. The sudden absence of the melody left a terrifying void, instantly swallowed by the violent, aggressive drumming of the sleet against the glass. I sat perfectly still, my shoulders shaking slightly, feeling the absolute, crushing weight of my own isolation. A sound cut through the noise of the storm. It was the heavy brass-handled door of the conservatory groaning open. It was not the subtle, economical entrance of the head butler. It was a slow, deliberate push, bearing the physical weight of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. I froze, my breath catching sharply in my ruined throat. I did not turn around immediately. I listened to the heavy, grounded footfalls echoing against the cold marble floor. He was not up in the shadowed mezzanine gallery tonight. He was not observing me from the safe, impenetrable darkness of a hidden balcony. He had come down the sweeping staircase. He had crossed the physical threshold of my domain. The heavy footsteps stopped just at the periphery of the candlelight. I took a slow, trembling breath, and I finally turned on the worn leather bench. Nicholas Sterling stood a mere 10 feet away from me. He was a towering, formidable figure, his broad shoulders filling the heavy, dark wool of his sweater. But what struck me instantly was not his immense wealth, nor the intimidating reputation that had preceded his signature on my father's debt contract. It was the raw, undeniable humanity etched into his features. The flickering candlelight illuminated the left side of his face, revealing the deep, jagged scars that ran from his temple down across the rigid line of his jaw. They were not the clean, surgical lines of a minor accident. They were ragged, profound marks of survival, pale tissue catching the amber light and casting tiny, uneven shadows. They were the physical manifestation of the defensive walls he had built around this isolated estate. Looking at them, I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of profound respect for a man who had clearly walked through absolute fire, and somehow managed to keep breathing. And then, he broke his ultimate rule. He looked at me. It was not a passing glance or a cautious, peripheral observation. The reclusive phantom who had fled his own cedar-scented study, rather than face my presence, locked his stormy, gray eyes directly onto mine. The visual impact was entirely staggering. For weeks I had been married to a ghost, to a smudge of charcoal on a glass frame, to a shadow retreating down a dark hallway. Now the ghost was flesh and blood, standing in the freezing light. His eyes were entirely exposed, stripped of any corporate authority or calculated indifference. They were bright, glassy, and overflowing with the heavy, glistening weight of raw, unshed tears. He was terrified. I could see the frantic pulse beating at the base of his throat, the slight, involuntary tremor in his jaw. The liability of eye contact was crushing him, yet he absolutely refused to look away. He took a slow, agonizing half-step forward, his large frame trembling under the immense psychological weight of the proximity. He did not make a grand, sweeping gesture. He did not attempt to speak. Instead, he reached out with a shaking hand and pressed his palm flat against the polished ebony wood of the piano's rim. He gripped the edge of the instrument so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white, steadying his large frame against the physical anchor I had spent days restoring. The billionaire who controlled vast empires was reduced to a trembling man, seeking support from a broken thing in an empty room. The silence stretched between us, taut and vibrating with unspoken gravity. I did not shrink back. I sat perfectly still on the bench, holding his tear-filled gaze, refusing to let him believe his scars were something he needed to hide from me. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow bursts. The rich scent of cedarwood washed over me, cutting cleanly through the sharp ozone of the storm and the lingering lavender oil. Slowly, carefully, he closed the remaining distance. He stopped right beside the piano bench, towering over me. He looked down at my hands, resting loosely in my lap. My knuckles were raw and reddened from hours of scrubbing, my fingertips slightly bruised from forcing the rusted metal pins of the internal strings. He reached out. His movements were painfully hesitant, like a man approaching a wounded bird, terrified that a sudden intake of breath might cause it to take flight. His large, warm hand hovered over for a fractured second, a momentary hesitation born of deep-seated trauma. Then, he gently lowered his palm, covering my cold, trembling fingers entirely. The contrast was profound. My skin was chilled from the ambient temperature of the room, stiff and aching from the physical labor. His skin was radiating a deep, intrinsic heat, a sudden infusion of warmth that instantly thawed the bitter coastal draft. He did not pull me into his arms. He did not attempt to bridge the remaining distance with a sudden, unearned physical embrace. Instead, he carefully, reverently lifted my hand from my lap and guided it upward. He pressed my palm flat against the absolute center of his chest. Beneath the thick wool of his sweater, I could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heartbeat. It was a racing, desperate rhythm, betraying the stoic, unyielding exterior he had maintained for so long. He looked down at me, the unshed tears finally spilling over his lower lashes, tracking slowly through the pale, jagged scars on his cheek. He opened his mouth, his throat working as he struggled to form the words. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a low, raspy whisper, rough from years of deliberate disuse and isolation. "Tell me to stop," he breathed, the words trembling with the absolute surrender of his pride. It was a quiet plea for boundaries, an offering of total and unconditional control. The man who owned this sprawling estate, the untouchable tycoon Chai-kun, who had cashed away the Vance family debts with a single stroke of his pen, was giving the isolated debt bride the power to banish him. He was waiting for my command. He was offering me the authority to reject him, to send him back to the sterile safety of the West Wing, to enforce the very rules of the printed contract he had drafted to protect his own wounded heart. I looked up into his stormy, tear-filled eyes. I felt the deep warmth of his chest beneath my palm, the solid, undeniable proof that the ghost of this mansion was a living, hurting man who simply needed a safe harbor. I did not use words. Spoken language felt entirely inadequate, too fragile and clumsy to hold the immense gravity of his vulnerability. Instead, I kept my right hand firmly pressed against the steady, frantic rhythm of his heart, absorbing his heat. I reached out with my left hand, extending my fingers over the yellowed ivory keys. I found the middle C. It was the stubborn, jammed key I had painstakingly freed with a bent metal hairpin days ago. I pressed it down softly. The single, resonant chord rang out into the freezing air, clear, sustaining, and perfectly tuned. It vibrated through the polished ebony wood, traveling up my arm and echoing into the vaulted glass ceiling above us, cutting beautifully through the chaotic noise of the storm. It was not a rejection. It was the absolute opposite. It was a quiet, undeniable invitation to stay. The tension drained from his broad shoulders in a sudden, heavy rush. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, closing his eyes as he slowly lowered his head, resting his forehead gently against mine. He did not ask for anything else. He did not demand a declaration or push for a deeper intimacy. He simply allowed himself to breathe the same pine-scented air, anchoring his massive frame to my quiet presence. We stayed like that for a long time, in the flickering candlelight, listening to the rain beat harmlessly against the thick glass walls outside. The imposing coastal estate shrank down until it was no larger than the small, warm circle surrounding the out-of-tune grand piano. I realized then that the transactional nature of our arrangement was entirely irrelevant. The proxy contract locked away in the dark drawer of my bedside table was nothing more than ink on dead paper. We were no longer a debt and a payment. We were two fiercely guarded souls who had finally found the courage to drop our armor in the dark, choosing each other without a single spoken vow. Days turned into weeks, and the cold marble of the mansion slowly began to hold a permanent warmth. The West Wing was no longer a forbidden sanctuary. Its heavy mahogany doors were left wide open, allowing the rich scent of cedarwood to mingle freely with the lavender in the long corridors. The man who once demanded absolute physical separation now spends his evenings sitting quietly on the worn leather piano bench beside me. He reads his architectural blueprints in the amber light while I play, his presence a steady, unwavering shield against the outside world. I do not need a grand, sweeping declaration of love. I do not need a public ceremony, a flawless diamond ring, or a perfectly orchestrated life to prove my worth. I just need him here, existing in the quiet spaces entirely visible and entirely mine. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. And some people, they leave the door open just wide enough so that when you're ready, you can finally step out of the cold. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.